This is El Salvador, located in Central America, the most dangerous country in the world. So dangerous that only 6 to 9 years ago it was called the murder capital of the world, because between 2014 and 2017, an average of 16 to 20 people were killed every day. The conditions here were so bad that around 20,000 pilgrims were killed in gang wars, and 20% of the population had to leave the country. But in the last 4 years, this most dangerous now come to the list of the safest countries in the world. The crime rate is now even lower than in the US. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, but geopolitically it is very important because of its location. El Salvador is south of Mexico, between Guatemala and Honduras, and then the Pacific. Due to its coastline with El Salvador, it also has access to the Panama Canal, which means that if the government is destabilized, the gangsters here can also damage the Panama Canal, one of the largest in the world, is a trade choke point, and that's why the US has always had a lot of interest in El Salvador. The relationship between the two countries is so close. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, El Salvador was the only Latin American country to join US coalition forces. In addition, all airports in El Salvador can be used by the US military at any time, and most of the US military uses this airport for counter-narcotics missions. If you go to El Salvador today, seeing the beauty and peace there, you won't be able to imagine that a few years ago this country was suffering from the worst violence. And that violence is tied to the history of El Salvador, as well as to something that many of us drink every morning, and that is coffee. At the beginning of the 19th century, El Salvador's coffee industry was booming. At that time, El Salvador was under the control of the Spanish Empire, and the coffee industry accounted for 95% of its GDP. 77% of El Salvador's agricultural land was controlled by 1% of the people, causing from which the income index was very high in El Salvador. Only 14 families controlled Salvador, who built all the lodges solely for their own benefit. El Salvador became independent from Spanish rule in 1821, but for the next several years the same family ruled El Salvador. Then from the 1930s to the 1970s, El Salvador had a military dictatorship that introduced land reform.